Welcome to the HIT Podcast, H.I.T, Human Resources, Insurance, and Technology. I'm your host, Toby Kennedy. As we do every week, we are dropping into your feed with what we hope are bite-sized, digestible, well-curated conversations about things going on in the space. This week's episode is brought to you by Montage Insurance Solutions. And without any further ado, let's get right into it. This week's episode acknowledges the kind of, you call it post-pandemic, right? Post-COVID sort of a thing. But the world we live in where employers are finding themselves having employees moving into areas they didn't previously have a nexus in, right? And so now you're an employer that maybe didn't necessarily know all the moving pieces about employees going out of state. Maybe it only ever had one location. You know everything you need to know about that one location. Your employees have scattered to the wind. So we're here today to talk about the top 5 things to know for you, the employer that has out-of-state employees. Starting with thing number 1. Thing number 1 is disability policies. So when you're an employer in the state of California, you get a little bit used to things, right? You're like, wow, the state of California offers a pretty robust disability policy. So for example, now in 2025 with limits bumped up a little bit, if your employees earn $63,000 a year or less, the state insures them up to 90% income replacement. And even above that threshold, it is 70% income replacement, right? Those numbers have bumped up. Historically, it used to be, 50, 60%, 60, 70% type of a thing. But nowadays, that break point, it's either 70% or 90% income replacement with the $63,000 earnings being the kind of line in the sand there. And it's a 52-week benefit. So it is a lengthy and robust disability policy. First and foremost, again, as that has ticked up a little bit over the years, I talk to employers all the time where it's like, look, before we even get into all the stuff about your out-of-state people, do our disability policies, our short-term disability, our long-term disability for our California folk, do they have language that acknowledges this robust California state disability insurance plan? Or, if we're paying into it, not every employer does, but if you're an employer paying into CASD, as they call it, right, that California short-term disability income protection program, your employees have this wonderful benefit. So if you have one of those old school, 90-day elimination periods, 60% or 66 2/3 income replacement, but it's not designed to sit on top of the state, they sort of offset, or do they stack on top of, or do they kind of integrate or not integrate? You might be paying for a policy that's not doing anything for you. So first and foremost, if you've got in and out of state people, you want to carve your disability policies around what the state's already offering, right? So carve out your California. So class 1 California, class 2 all others, right? To say, hey, look, what I'm paying for, let's have it augment. Maybe you only buy a 10% policy that sits on top, or you push your elimination period out to, 12 months, 52 weeks, 365 days, however you want to call it, to run concurrent with the state benefit. Or maybe you just look at the higher earners that might be underinsured and write an executive disability policy to sit on top of that, right? So setting aside, making sure that for your California population, any private short-term, long-term disability plans you're paying for makes sense with the state benefit. Outside of California, got a little benefit, New York, New Jersey, Hawaii, Rhode Island, people throw Puerto Rico kind of around. It's like, it is not the norm to have state disability. So some employers that did the other thing, instead of, having an insurance policy and having the state, maybe they don't have anything, right? They just have the state of California, and you're thinking, well, my employees are fine. If you've got employees that move into other states, the benefits they have might be nothing, or it might be substantially reduced, right? So for example, in the state of New York, it's 50% income replacement to a max of 26 weeks, right? So it's not going to be as strong as California. So when you look at these other states, it might be nothing, or it might be something not quite as strong. So the first thing I talk to people, hey, listen, you've got employees in other states. If you're kind of trained in the grounds of California, set aside the idea that their local government is taking care of them if they need income replacement, and grapple with what you want to do as an employer. If your employee can no longer come to work, a doctor tells them, hey, God forbid, you are no longer capable of performing the essential functions of your job. Person still needs to make rent, still needs to buy groceries, right? Still needs an income protection. It's not coming from the state. So something to think about as you design your disability policies. let's get into thing number two. Some states have statutory accounts you have to have. So for example, commuter benefits, right? Commuters where you set aside $325, it goes towards like transit or parking. It's kind of in the flexible spending account arena. You've got your healthcare flex, your dependent care flex. You've got commuter. You've got dollars that you can set aside, and you, the employer, might have a mandate to have a commuter plan that you might not have in your portfolio. So far, New Jersey is the only state that mandates it. But this is the part of the conversation where we go, yeah, you know how we had to drill down by state? You got to drill down even further, because places like New York, DC, Seattle, you've got more local than just state. You've got counties now that are mandating, depending upon how many employees you have. Sometimes the threshold might be 10 employees, might be 20 employees. But as you start getting employees in a certain area, another thing you might need to worry about is, do you have to take out a commuter benefit that you might not otherwise have? And sometimes maybe you don't have enough employees to trigger that. Maybe you don't have the 20 employees required in New York or Seattle, or the 10 employees required in other places like Berkeley, right? The threshold that you do or don't cross makes it mandatory sometimes, but otherwise it's just kind of knowing, gosh, from a recruitment and retention standpoint, from a competitiveness standpoint, I didn't even think about this, but because it's statutory at a certain size, so many of the employers make it basically table stakes that as an employer that's now trying to recruit a second, third, fifth person in New York, for example, I maybe need to look at adding a commuter benefit. And again, as we're talking about local places, just kind of hitting on, I know, we picked on New York a little bit. San Francisco is another place from a statutory standpoint. They're making up a healthy San Francisco ordinance. You're like, HCSO, what? Like, what's going on there? If you've got employees in San Francisco, you need to know that you have to spend a certain amount of dollars, and it's a lot easier to qualify as an employer to have to trigger this one, where it's like, okay, on an hourly basis, and it ranges on your size, but about, $2.25 to about $3.50, give or take, dollars per hour of labor worked by an employee, full-time, part-time in that area, you have to spend on healthcare expenses, qualified healthcare expenses. So yes, for some groups, your premium towards your medical, dental, vision counts, and you pay enough towards that to where you satisfy that. But what about part-time employees that aren't eligible for your benefits, aren't on your benefits? You might have employees working in San Francisco that you're not spending the requisite amount towards healthcare for. So you have to take out, either pay the city option, which is what a lot of people do, or a qualified HRA sort of a thing. But inside of the city bounds of San Francisco itself, there's this whole healthcare security ordinance going on there. And it's not just these kind of statutory accounts and things. There's also the sort of mandated policies you have to have, right? So a lot of states have mandatory paid family leave, for example. California, Colorado, Delaware, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Oregon, Washington, and then voluntary plans in some states like Vermont, right? So these are places where you have to have a paid family leave policy. So making sure that you're aware, okay, backing this up, number one, did I get my disability policy, my kind of private disability to make sense for my California population, my out-of-state population, with respect to what they have in their own state? What about some of the kind of statutory maybe accounts I have to open up? Do I or do I not have to do commuter? Random local stuff like in San Francisco, their healthy ordinance, and then looking at some of the leave policies you have to have as well as we get employees into these new states. And that brings me to the next super important thing to think about when we're talking about local government. New York is famous for its PFL and DBL, right? It's paid family leave and then disability benefits law. These two sort of policies that you have to have if you're in New York. It's like, do I have my PFL and my DBL sorted out? One of them, the rates are kind of set by the state, so there's really no reason to kind of ask your broker or consultant to see multiple different pricing options. And the other one, if you've got fewer than 50 in the state, they're really kind of using canned rates. So it's kind of just go ahead and use your own disability carrier for these policies. But these are additional policies you have to take out when you're doing business in the state of New York, on top of all the other things that we're talking about. which brings me kind of like the next big bullet point. Number 4 thing to consider when you're nationwide is benefits laws are different state by state. So in each different state, they've got their own sort of set of what goes and what doesn't go. And a kind of weird little example, that Texas has this weird dental law and out-of-network coverage needing to be on parity with in-network coverage, right? So you can't have those steerage plans where on the in-network side, preventive, basic, majors covered at, whatever, 100, 50, 60 type of a thing. And then out of networks covered at 50% or 80% preventive care, right? If your preventive care is 100% covered in network, it's got to be 100% covered out of network. Obviously, the dollar figure might change for in and out of network, but the benefit summaries needing to look the same in and out of network might not be the plan design you have, right? And whether you're fully insured or self-funded on the medical side, you might also need to look to see, do my benefits policies trigger any state or local laws now that my employee has moved to this other state? And the last thing, the 5th thing, right? We've talked a little bit about benefits and kind of mandates, but the workers' comp. Workers' comp, number 1, the workers' comp carriers, they would love to have these things scheduled, if not the actual home address, usually at least the area and, kind of minimum the state. They need to know, listed on kind of your schedule of locations, hey, I've got employees in these sort of different states now. And certain states, there's only a few of them, but they get even more frustrating with what they call monopolistic coverage, meaning your workers' comp carrier can't even potentially write there. You have to write with the state. This comes up a lot with folks that go up to Seattle because Washington is one of those monopolistic states. Ohio also famously, but randomly North Dakota and Wyoming sneak in there too. So there's a few states on the workers' comp side even where you have to write a separate policy. These are kind of the things to consider as your employees move out of state and are moving all around. Really quickly, while we're talking about workers' comp, if you've made it this far, God bless you, because we're going to give you a quick nugget to remind you about those 300 A-logs. So about that time of year to get those guys up and make sure they're taken care of. If you have anything to do with workers' comp, make sure you got those logs up. You know what I'm talking about. But that's kind of the overview on the out-of-state stuff, where it's like you want to make sure your benefits line up and aren't tripping you up, that your workers' comp carriers are aware, and that you're looking into kind of statutory accounts, statutory policies, lining up your benefits and making sure everything looks good. As in this new kind of remote work world, we've got employees entering different states. So a couple tips and tricks for you out there. So thank you very much for sitting through as we get through what I think are a couple of really interesting things to think about for employees moving out of state. We appreciate you so much. That's all the time we have for you this week here on the podcast. Thanks again for watching, and thank you to our sponsors, TrueHue. And until next week, make this the best week yet.